My name's Patricia Clark, and I'm from Washington State, way out there on the coast, Tacoma, or I usually say Seattle because that's easier. People know where Seattle is, so that's where I'm from. I interviewed at the MLA conference, and of course I had applied to Grand Valley State University. I hadn't heard of Grand Valley University, but I'd heard of Grand Rapids, of course, from Gerald Ford. And then when I really enjoyed the interview and got invited here, I was pretty excited. And then when I came to campus, I was even more excited because I liked the people and I liked the place. So then I learned a lot more. But it was a job that brought me here. I do think of people in the Pacific Northwest and people in Michigan as being an immediate audience, but I hope that the readers are all kinds of people out there who I don't know. I've gotten a few fan letters from time to time of complete strangers, and that's always really interesting. Obviously, writers know a lot of other writers and share work with each other, and you always want to please people and have people be interested in what you're writing about. I'm thinking of a particular poet, Alice Fryman, who I share work with. And she's really a tough critic and a good reader. So she'll say, I think that ending kind of falls off. It's not really working for me. And so I kind of learn a kind of standard that I'm aiming for myself and that I think other people are aiming for. In terms of interesting language and interesting ways of saying things, even interesting subjects. So she's someone I have in mind. Oh yeah, she'll send me a piece and ask me a particular question. Do I really need this whole stanza? Could I cut this out? And I try and give her the best feedback I can. It's kind of fun. There's a lot more of that than goes on than people realize at first. When students ask why they're doing so much peer editing and peer work, we tell them, that's really going to be how it's like if you become a writer. There's a lot of sharing your work. There's a lot of getting feedback. And you're really, in a way, quite foolish if you're not doing that and getting feedback, because why do you want to just send something to an editor or a magazine without knowing a few things ahead of time? So that's kind of how it works. Well, I think the biggest job, as I saw it, was to provide a higher profile for poetry. It's there. I mean, most people, frankly, are not thinking about poetry, but some people are. And then National Poetry Month is something that people hear about, April. I think the city, they're looking for good times. They don't want you to highlight the darkest poetry in the world. Not that anyone ever says that. But they're wanting the community to come together, and we did some readings. I think we did one that was modeled after Robert Pinsky's favorite poem project. I forget the exact title. And so we asked a number of people, like the mayor and the police chief, I think, and some other people to choose a favorite poem of theirs and then get up and read it. I think Pinsky's idea was he made an archive of all those people and the poems that they chose. So it was like a historical archive of what poems people really found meaningful to them. So we were kind of doing the same thing, and people usually would say a couple of sentences about why they found that poem meaningful, and then they would read it. So it would kind of show people in the community that even a football player, we had the quarterback for the team, I don't know what team that was, the Grand Rapids football team. Who were they? He was a really cute quarterback. But he was a big star. And for young people and people in the community to see someone who is known in a completely other role to get up and read a poem, it kind of shocks people, and it kind of rocks them a little bit that people, that a lot of people have a favorite poem. So we found that to be fun. And I think the city I don't think I was asked to write a particular poem for the city. Other poet laureates were, but I did the audio and some writing for a Grand Rapids neighborhood video that they were doing. So I thought it was a neat job, and it was fun to do and fun to figure out events to highlight poetry. Yeah, it was really fun to do those events. Well, I was figuring them out with the woman who was coordinating for the Humanities Council, and she and I would get together and talk about what would be meaningful to do. So it was really fun to do those events for the city, and really fun to see the audience come, and I think they did care about poetry. And you know, we think a lot of times that learning is about learning facts or dates or certain things that went on in history, but there's also the education of one's emotional life. And I think it's really important for people to know how to feel, and that feeling about things is a good thing, although it can be painful. And so to read poems about a death or a birth, both joy and sorrow, is really meaningful for people. And I think that that's kind of overlooked sometimes in schools and certainly in a city. But we wanted to highlight more of that. Well, I don't think it was really much different. You know, again, it was to highlight, give poetry a somewhat higher profile on campus or in the city. A slightly different thing at Grand Valley was that every year there's a convocation that starts off the school year, and all of the new freshmen come and gather, and there's a bunch of speeches and stuff. And they, at the time, asked me to write a poem each year for that event. And again, that was kind of fun. It was a challenge, but to highlight poetry and to show the students that poetry had a place on campus and a place at the university. Then I think it led to things that ended up being poetry night, because they were interested in having poets come to campus too and give readings. Each year, it was pretty fascinating. I would say to my students, I tried to require that they attend poetry night, but in truth, I couldn't really force them to attend if they had a job or other things that they were doing. So I would kind of tantalize them by saying, you know, look at Terrence Hayes. He's going to be reading. He's really an interesting guy. He paints as well as writes. I would say to them, you know, it's kind of a fun night to come to. If you want to dress up a little, you could dress up. People do that. You could bring a date. You could bring any kind of friend you want. And then I would say, you'd be surprised how many people care about poetry and come. And they would be really blown away. They would say to me, my gosh, I had no idea so many people would come. And then they would be really blown away by the writers, because typically we picked people who were both good readers and good writers. And they would end up buying their books and just saying, wow, I had no idea. So it was really something. I'm thinking of Terrence Hayes, but there would be a lot of other people too. Mark Doty, people who would write poems about unusual things, even kind of racy things, and read these poems at the university, and the president was often there. And so they were just kind of blown away that this was something that the community cared about and the world cared about. So it was very, very touching to me. And often I would ask them later to write a review of the night, too, a little critique. Not about me, but about the event and what it was like. And they would just say beautiful things, that they, just like what I'm saying, that they had no idea so many people cared, and that they were really impressed that someone like Terrence Hayes, who was, you know, such a guy, could get up and read his poems. And so it was really meaningful. And I would share those letters, those critiques with the president's office. I was no fool. I wanted them to know that the students said it really mattered to them a lot. It really was cool because, you know, I knew if they came, they would be blown away. But of course, getting them to come, and I would say there's not going to be a test. You know, there's nothing horrible is going to happen. There's refreshments. There was a little alcohol that they had if they were old enough to drink, and I shamelessly did try to lure them in with every technique that I had, didn't I? You know, somehow as a young person, I got caught up with books and reading. Maybe it was my grandmother who sent books for Christmas from Boston. It could have been the public library, where I spent an awful lot of time and read an awful lot of books about dogs and horses when I was little. But I really can't unravel my life from that. And when I think back, like, what was I up to in my mind? I really don't have a good answer. I don't think I knew yet that I wanted to be a writer. I didn't know any writers. It didn't occur to me that such a thing was possible. Even when I got to college, as you can see, I majored in economics, but I wasn't aware of the creative writing program at University of Washington, and if they had readings, I didn't know about that. I did have a freshman writing teacher, composition teacher, who told us about a reading. She said that Annie Dillard was going to come to campus, and she encouraged us to go. And I loved this teacher, and I thought, I'm going. And I got there, never having gone to events. Probably I got there at 5 minutes before the event started, and they said it was full, and that we were going to have to go into an overflow room. And I'm like, no, I don't think so. So I waited there persistently, and at the last minute, they said they had some front row seats that people hadn't come in for, and I could come in with other people and go down and sit down front. So that was really the beginning, and Annie Dillard, of course, was fantastic, such a good writer. And then it began to dawn on me that there were living people who were writers. It still didn't really occur to me that that was possible. But gradually, I think through various things, it became more clear to me. I think the schools are doing better. You know, I feel for the teachers, because if you invite in living people, subject matter and language gets to be such an issue, and things have gotten so political in terms of what you can talk about. So I think actually that's why teachers are afraid of contemporary poetry, is because it gets into all kinds of stuff that they really don't want to get into. So if you read old dead people, it's much simpler. It's in the past, et cetera, et cetera. And I think teachers are doing a lot better with inviting people into classes and having people come. You know, and often in many states there's a poetry in the schools program. And I don't know if Michigan has ever really had that, but I know other states have, and they go into classes and sub, you know, maybe for a week and do a creative writing unit, give the teacher a break. And then students see that there are living people. And, you know, we keep hearing from people of color and people with different gender orientations how important it is for them to see someone who looks like them. And I think the schools need to really work on that harder, to make sure that students know that there's a range of people and that they're in there too. They'll fit in. So I don't know if that answers it. I think it does. I think it does. And college, I tried to say to students, because sometimes, you know, I remember a particular poet who read a poem about a police shooting and something about that, and said, if I'm found dead and there's a policeman around anywhere, you know, like, he killed me. And I had students who were just outraged by that. And one guy even wrote, you know, the police are our friends, and how could this person say this about the police? And I tried to say kind of gently, imagine life not as your life, but as an African-American person in the city of Chicago and how that might feel. I tried to choose people to come to campus who were not controversial necessarily, and I won't even go into, one time I got into trouble about one poet, but I wanted people who the audience would connect with. I didn't want someone who was just completely dry and, and there's so many good poets out there. So sometimes the pairing was really interesting too. Like we had Ted Kooser with Terrence Hayes. And it seems like at first, well, how do they fit together at all? But it was an interesting matchup. And then students could, it wasn't just one poet, they had two, so they could kind of compare and contrast and say, oh, I really liked this about him, and I really liked this about him. And so they had more ways to enter the dialogue, I think, by having a couple of poets. Yeah, the process is really fascinating, and I think a little bit misunderstood, because I think I always hate movie portrayals of writers and their writing life, because they often have people who are really deranged and addicted to all kinds of things, and then things come in a flash to them. And that's not really how it works at all. And I think the more someone establishes a practice, a writing practice, every day, a certain time, you sit down and write, you're more likely to have those moments of inspiration because you're there, because you were working. You're going to have days when you write nothing, or days when you write and it's really terrible. I mean, in a lot of ways, critiquing is not what you're up to. You're really trying to write and try to understand and see what you get. And so I try to turn off the part of my brain that's saying, this is stupid, why did I write this, it's trite, it's going nowhere. I try and turn off my brain on that and evaluate later on. I try and just put in some time and have that practice of reflection, looking around, checking in with the self. So the state of mind in some ways matters and doesn't matter. You are trying to accurately tell the truth about what life is like for you and maybe for others. But it's going to take some writing and then revision, going back to it and saying, boy, that was a nice start, that one sentence, but then it really went lame somehow, and I've got to go back and re-energize the language and make it better, make it tell more of the truth. I lapsed into kind of usual kind of trite observances when I can do better. So I don't think it's so much about your state of mind, because again, I try and write no matter how I feel that day. And I usually say to myself, you can write or you can sit there, but I don't want you can't do email, you can't get into other things, because soon you're sidetracked and you're not writing. I actually write longhand, not with the computer. And so I try not to take out my computer or anything, any devices, because I find I'm way too easily sidetracked. And so I think if you put in time, what happens is on a day when you haven't felt like it, after you've been there an hour or so, you don't want to bore yourself either. And so you'll find yourself finding something more interesting to look at or write about. And on a day that seemed very unpromising, you can all of a sudden have the beginning of something. So I think persistence. I know the poet Philip Levine, I heard him say more than once that he was the least talented writer among his classmates at University of Iowa. But he had decided he maybe wasn't talented, but he was pig-headed, he was dogged, and he could hang in there. And I loved hearing that story, because I thought, I can do that too. You know, you look around and a lot of students want to know, do I have it? Am I talented? Am I good? Or whatever. And really, that's not really the right question. The question is are you in it for the long term? Can you hang in there through rejections and disappointments and failures and still keep writing? And that's the real question, because it's the person who can deal with disappointment and rejection that's going to hang in there as a writer. You need a lot of that. You need a lot of guts, really, to hang in there. I mean, there certainly are times when you think, why am I doing this? I mean, if you weren't, I think it's the Polish poet Szymborska. I butcher her first name, Wisła Szymborska, I think, who said, I prefer the madness of writing poetry to the madness of not writing poetry. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. I mean, it's an insane thing to do in a lot of ways, but there are a lot of payoffs personally. And I don't mean getting something published. I mean in learning how to reflect, in learning how to kind of make sense, if there is any sense to be made, of living and daily life. Many poets have said that. I know Bob Hickok said that too when he was on campus, that poetry for him was a way of making sense of his daily life. And so it does take, you do wonder at times, why am I doing this? But then the rewards, again, of that process, it's just so interesting over time, not to mention how much more interesting just how many sentences you can write in interesting ways. You know, the sentence is kind of amazing when you think about it, that you start writing something, you don't know where it's going, but I don't plan out a sentence so that I know the end when I start it. So it's really a miracle of linguistics and writing that you start a sentence and it ends up, it's coherent and it says something. And because you're trying not to bore yourself and not to bore your readers, you end up learning how to really turn a sentence and make it a very, very interesting thing over time. It's like learning how to work with wood, I suppose, and carve things. So it's a skill. It's both a skill, a craft, and then a lot of things that can't be taught. But that part is really fascinating, and I think it's underplayed in the discussion about writing, because it's really interesting to write those sentences. Also, I think it's little understood that poets look stuff up, and they do use research, and they don't know everything that they set down to write about. I just got a book from the library about bird migration, because I really like birds and watching birds, and I have no idea what I'm looking for. I'm not really looking for anything in this book, but I suspect that some poems are going to come out of it, because it's just such a fascinating thing that birds, the Kirtland warbler, goes to the Bahamas every fall, way down to the Bahamas, this little tiny bird, and spends 7 months in the Bahamas. What a good choice. Eating lots of bugs and other things. And so I think it's, you know, poets are writing about themselves and about their life, but they're also looking at interesting things to write about. And we're in a bit of a crisis with the environment and global warming. So I think it's pretty concerning about birds and where things are headed. So I think it's timely. So writers are out there looking at subjects too and trying to learn and figure things out. This is called My Mother's Shoes, and the title reads into the first line. My mother's shoes are not as beautiful as I'd like them to be. They are white, thick-soled. She limps in them, and another pair, sandals, reveal her gnarled toes under wide Velcro straps. I go back in time, her closet, seeking ones I can put on a pedestal, heels of an ice blue, for a wedding perhaps, narrow shoes with an instep arch, curved, sexy as a woman's waist, or like the graceful line of neck into collar, clavicle, bone, are linked to birds and flight, always the swan. Now I see her walking barefoot down to Commencement Bay, and the islands out across the water are blue-green hulks that could be whales. Her sister, Ruth, is visiting from Raleigh. What year is this? Back from the dead, they are the age I am now, no longer young. And I hardly notice my mother's leg veins purple and knotted, or Ruth's belly protruding. They bend together in laughter, holding hands. It's all sand, no shoes needed, and they walk in beauty into the forgiving hem of water, up to their ankles, knees, and thighs. Then, free of gravity, they splash in and swim. So that's something new to go in the next book, I hope. So, kind of work at each poem one at a time and just keep going. And I don't really look back and say, oh, what themes or what's happening, but I trust in the process that there will be themes, there will be continuities. So then when I get enough, and I'm not there yet, I think I'm halfway to another book. Do I look back now halfway? I haven't really. And then things happen, like the war in Ukraine, and other writing comes in, and themes change a bit. So I don't really know. Certainly some of my standard kind of themes, like connection with the natural world, connections with people, how well do we know other people? How well can we know other people? How well can we know ourselves? Where do we find comfort in a world that's troubling and violent and scary at times? Or a world of diminishing beauty, if that's true, that birds are, 30, I forget what percentage, 30% of the bird population was down, a tremendous number in the last count that they made. And so how do you go on hearing about that and knowing those things? Maybe we should put down our pens and go to the barricades and, go work on the environment and give up poetry altogether. But it's not my skill exactly. So, you keep at it. But those are probably, if that's a little confusing, but those are a few themes that would be in there in the next book. Don't know really what it will be. I think children are really, the sad thing about college teaching is students initially will say in a creative writing class, oh, I hate poetry. We're going to do fiction and nonfiction and poetry. They'll say, I hate poetry. And I think, how is it possible? How have we taught people and got them to the point they say they hate poetry, where children naturally just love poetry. They love little rhymes and riddles and wordplay. So I go back to that. In fact, that's often what I say to myself when I'm writing in the morning. Don't worry about meaning. Play with words and have some fun with words and sounds. And I think that's really what got me into poetry at the start, was reading people like Dylan Thomas and E. E. Cummings, who really, they were doing forms. I didn't know that then. Of course, I knew what rhyme was, but I think it was their love of language, lush language. A poem like Fern Hill by Dylan Thomas, you can't read that poem and not want to go out and dance around and then write your own poem. So I think children really get it way more than adults, and we should look to them for guidance, really, on poetry. Because those little rhymes and things look how fun it is. It immediately makes people smile and be happy reading poetry. So you can't hate poetry. That's just impossible. It's like hating a whole type of food. Impossible. You haven't tried enough cuisines if you don't like, if you don't like Thai food or if you don't like Mexican food. Come on. and be open to all kinds of poetry. Why do you want to rule out a certain kind? It's like ruling out certain kinds of music, or again, food. Enjoy as much of it as you can. That's a gift, really. So open your heart. You know, we separate all these art forms out. Why do we? I guess, like at a university, you have to have departments and you have to have separations. But in a lot of ways, it's very false. My husband's a painter, oil painter, and so we talk about these issues a lot. And there's a painter, Cy Twombly, that we've both been intrigued by, and he writes words onto the canvas and then paints all over them. And some of the words will drip down and looks like kind of blood running from them. And so I think those cross-boundary things are particularly fascinating. And young people are very impatient with these false barriers we put up between. So I think teachers have learned from them in the past years, because I think the blending of genres, types of writing, has increased, and people are just impatient again with these false little, well, this is poetry, this is fiction. It still kind of drives me crazy what was the category I saw that a bookstore had? Oh, if you call something a fiction novel, that kind of drives me nuts. I mean, I think that
nonfiction novel.
Nonfiction novel, yeah, really? That's confusing. So I think in many ways it's useful to look at those blends across, and poets can learn from that. They can learn from the visual arts, and they can learn from trying to be nonverbal. Why not? Look at grass and just put it in a little arrangement, or a bird nest. You know, it was really liberating to look at things another way. And in a lot of ways, I think poets have it way harder than fiction writers. I often would say this to my colleagues. You know, like writing a novel, how hard is that? You start with an idea, and then every day you just keep going. But poets have to start over and over each time. Poems typically are quite short. So you've got to come up with stuff, and it's not easy. And so I think looking at visual arts, or being given an assignment even, you know, like write a poem about a scarf, or write a poem about, you know, or write a poem and use these 5 words, or write a poem and don't use any adjectives. They're just cool assignments you can give yourself. And I think working with visual art is a very, very nice way. It really can open up your imagination to all kinds of things. Just look at color, what kind of words come out of colors. There's just a lot of things to ask yourself. So it was liberating and fun, and I think fun is not to be sneered at. You know, if you can have some fun in life, that's good, because a lot of it is fairly grim. And so a little bit of fun is all to the good. And it's probably going to open you up to feeling and knowing certain things that you didn't realize you knew. I have a book called She Walks into the Sea, which I think of as a book about my mother. And I don't think I had the best relationship with my mother. Tomorrow's Mother's Day, and I have a poem called Birthday Dinner where I speak against my mother. And a couple of women who I'm at dinner with speak against their mothers too. In terms of this, that they preferred the brothers, the mother, and made no bones about it, and how that makes you feel when you're a girl and young. So we all said these things at dinner, and I guess I was surprised at how, in a way, violent that felt in the poem, because you're just not supposed to speak against your mother, really. That's kind of wrong. And I said in the poem, I could feel her anger from, you know, wherever she is in the other world. And I don't really know if that's true, but so I think you just learn amazing things. And then She Walks into the Sea, I have a couple of poems about my mother where I realized in the poem, in the tone, in the words, that I was putting together, there was both love and hurt both in that poem, because things hadn't always been good. And I guess I was surprised at the intensity of my love for my mother, even though it was difficult at times. So I think poetry can take you there if you listen, and if you're patient, and you work on the words and are open to being surprised. Some of the quote-unquote knowledge in poetry is not in the words, it's in the sound. And so repetition has, I think, a really, really powerful force. It's a force, really. And by repeating, you lull yourself into something. And my teacher, one of my teachers was Dick Hugo. He was really into that, and he believed that you should follow the music in a poem, and that the music would always take you to a bigger truth than actual words. So I'm really happy when I can really do what I think he wanted me to do and other poets to do, which is follow the music and see where that takes you. And it will surprise you, and it will be a deeper knowledge, a felt knowledge, a subsonic knowledge than words. So he said it really well in this book of his called Triggering Town about creative writing. If you stumble over something, if something isn't said, it doesn't always have to be in a soothing way. Maybe you want kind of roughness in a particular part. So that isn't what you're looking for, but you're just looking for mistakes, really, a sound mistake or a collision mistake. And I don't have a good example of that, I don't think. I can't even think of one in my... I think also whether it's a word that doesn't fit. Maybe the word is out of a different register. Instead of being a common language, all of a sudden you've got a word that's very intellectual. Does that really fit in the poem? Does that make sense? Or is it going to be a jarring? Again, sometimes maybe you want a jarring thing, but I often don't know why you would. I would say to students, and I think it's true, the rule of distraction. Are you distracted out of the dream of the poem or the story? And if you are, was that worth it? Or do you want to stay in the dream of the poem? And so I think to read it out loud, you'll hear better. I spent some time when I was a younger poet just memorizing other people's poems. And I think there's a lot of ear training that should go on, maybe more than is happening today with young people, so that you not only can hear the stresses of things, but you can hear just all kinds of nuances. So I think memorizing and reciting is really good and fun, and I think young people really like it. One time I wanted students to recite poems and memorize and come into class, and the first question was always, how long does the poem have to be? And I said, at least 14 lines. And then a woman in the class, probably the oldest woman, older than me at the time, gray hair, memorized Birches by Robert Frost, which I think is about 110 lines, and came in and recited it perfectly. So the students were really shocked and put to shame at their, 14-line thing. When I came to GVSU, it was unknown to me that there had been these national poetry festivals in the 70s. And so that was really cool. And I think in a lot of ways, it laid the groundwork for President Lubbers being interested in having a poet laureate, and then laid the groundwork even for poetry night and getting a good audience. Because I think there were people in the city of GR, not out in Allendale, who really cared about poetry, always had from the 70s, and they held on to it, and they came. So that was really a nice surprise. And I really was thrilled by that. I'm thinking of Walter Foote and Rachel, his wife. And maybe they weren't here in the 70s, although I think they were. And they would come every year to poetry night. And other people did too, who would come up and talk to me, and I'd think, who are you? But they had great stories of the old days. Judith Minty is someone too who had been around and saw those poets in the 70s. So I know the archive will have a lot of things about those festivals, and I think that's really important. But that was here, and a very cool thing. And I think it added, and still adds today, to an underlying interest in poetry that's in the city of Grand Rapids. I was a preliminary judge once, and I think the final judge one year, but it was a great thing to encourage students to submit to. Anything that's professional like that is really a good teaching device. So we would say, you know, you might consider, because it would come, I think, in February, the call for work, and they would have a lot of questions, you know. I would tell them the first thing is you want something really good to submit. But then we would talk about, well, what kind of work do you submit, you know, and what are judges looking for? How do you know that a judge might like your work? And of course, if you try a particular form, a poetry form, a sestina, a villanelle, a pantoum, some of these forms show your knowledge and your interest in poetry, and a judge is probably going to say, wow, this is someone who knows a lot, even before I go to read the poem. So it was a really good teaching device, and I think the students who won or placed in the competition were thrilled, and it was really nice. And they got to read downtown at festival usually, and then there was a booklet and a publication. So it's a great thing to have. This one's also new. And I think a friend gave me this assignment. So I thought, okay, that poet Alice Fryman, she's a clever one. So it's called Self-Portrait. Give me a face to cover my face. I've looked at myself too long. Thin lips, one eyebrow dented in, almost hairless, and those gray pools underneath my eyes. I could tell you the history of the lines around my mouth, the estuaries at corners of my eyes. Right in the center of my face, the prow of my nose pushing its way into the day's new hours. If not entirely straight, it wears its charms, detecting salt water from miles off, burnt toast at 20 feet. Years ago, finding Modigliani's portraits, I relaxed into my own, falling in love with his model's dark hair, eyes like coal, wearing berets and colorful scarves, or sometimes they were swan-necked nudes, a ruddy blush of shyness on their cheeks. Embracing asymmetry, I could love them all more than me over time. If we aren't the surfaces of ourselves, who is it lurking beneath, hoping to sneak out? A hermit crab pulling its shell behind it on damp sand, scrawling a mark in some illegible, obscure calligraphy, tugging and taking on the shell's weight. There on a neap tide night, waves glinting at the edge.